The first betrayal. The sun's first light sliced through the grime-streaked blinds of Rick Daniels' apartment. The world outside seemed just as fractured as the room inside, a mix of disheveled furniture, neglected beer cans, and stale air. Rick sat at the edge of his unmade bed, his hands pressed against his throbbing temples, trying to squeeze out the remnants of his last night's mistakes. His head was pounding, an unwelcome reminder of the life he was leading, a life that seemed to be spinning out of control. He had barely made it through the night without drowning in alcohol, and now the harsh buzz of his alarm clock cut through his foggy mind like a jagged knife. "Shut up," Rick muttered as he reached over to silence the alarm, his fingers brushing against his service pistol on the nightstand. The cold steel of the weapon reminded him of the constant danger of his profession and of his choices. His phone buzzed again, this time with the unmistakable name of Captain James Monroe flashing on the screen. 5 missed calls. The captain never called unless something was seriously wrong. 5 calls meant something big was coming, and Rick could already feel the knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Rick let out a sigh, rubbing his hands through his disheveled hair. He knew he couldn't put it off any longer. Whatever Monroe wanted, it wouldn't be good news. The smell of stale beer and the sharp scent of his unwashed clothes hung in the air as he stood up, every joint in his body protesting the effort. He shuffled to the bathroom, splashing cold water onto his face. The reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a man he didn't recognize anymore. Bloodshot eyes, stubble that had long since gone from 5 o'clock shadow to full-blown neglect. His face was marked by deep lines, each one a testament to the secrets he carried. By 7:15 a.m., Rick was back at District 17 Police Station, the precinct at the heart of Hamilton Heights. The building had always been a place of noise, of hurried footfalls, and overheard conversations. But today, it felt different. There was an electricity in the air that Rick couldn't ignore. The station smelled as it always did: stale coffee, lingering cigarette smoke, and the sharp tang of disinfectant that never quite masked the reality of a broken system. As Rick moved through the precinct, his boots echoing against the worn floors, he was aware of the energy around him. Officers bustled in and out of briefing rooms, the conversations blurring into white noise. "Rough night," Officer Peterson called out as Rick passed by. Rick didn't respond. He didn't have the energy for small talk today. Not with the unease gnawing at him. Not with Monroe's calls hanging like a shadow over him. He knew something was coming, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be easy. The briefing room was packed when he walked in. Officers were already seated, their faces drawn and tense. Rick found a spot at the back, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the weight of the room's collective unease. The hum of the fluorescent lights above made everything feel sickly, like they were all trapped under some kind of oppressive glow. When Captain Monroe entered, the room fell silent. Rick's stomach churned at the sight of him. Monroe had a presence that could command a room without a single word. His uniform was always crisp, his hair perfectly combed, an image of authority that sharply contrasted with the tired, overworked officers around him. Monroe's eyes scanned the room as he slammed a folder onto the podium, the sharp crack of it silencing any remaining murmurs. "We've got a problem," Monroe said, his voice carrying across the room. "The mayor's breathing down my neck, and I want results. Crime's spiking in Hamilton Heights, and we need to send a message. I don't care who, just get me arrests. I want them now." Rick's jaw tightened. He'd heard this speech too many times before. It wasn't about justice. It was about numbers. Monroe needed arrests to quell the rising tide of complaints and political pressure, and it didn't matter who got caught in the net. By 9 o'clock a.m., Rick sat at his desk, the cold cup of coffee beside him untouched. The morning briefing had set everything in motion. Officers were already gearing up, heading out to make arrests. As he sat there, he watched them, their eager discussions about which corners to hit and which usual suspects to round up. They still had that look, the one Rick had once had. The look of someone who believed in the system, in the idea that they were doing the right thing. Rick had lost that belief a long time ago. He didn't need to watch any longer. He knew what was coming. The truth was, they didn't need evidence. They didn't need leads. All they needed was a target, someone who looked the part. And Rick knew exactly who would be their target today. Monroe's orders were always clear. Find someone who fit the profile and make the charges stick. No questions asked. No investigation necessary. The sun had long since risen when Rick left his desk, heading out on his usual beat. His boots clicked against the cracked sidewalk, his eyes scanning the streets for the usual signs of life. Mothers hurrying their kids to school. Teenagers hanging out on stoops. Old men playing chess in the park. But today, Rick wasn't looking for the usual suspects. Today, he had his orders. It didn't take long for him to spot her. She was sitting alone at a cafe, a black woman in a navy blue suit. The woman's presence was out of place in the rundown neighborhood. Her posture was too perfect. Her clothes were too expensive. Rick's gut told him something was off. He'd seen it before, the confident demeanor of someone who didn't belong. And he knew that the system worked best when it had someone to take the fall. Rick moved into the cafe, his eyes trained on the woman as he waited for his coffee. His fingers grazed the small bag of cocaine in his pocket, his usual insurance policy, just enough to plant on someone to fill the quota. He'd done it 100 times before, and it always worked. When she stood to leave, Rick timed it perfectly. He bumped into her, his hand slipping into her pocket to deposit the bag of cocaine. He stepped back, a practiced apology on his lips, but his heart was pounding. He was playing his part, just as he had so many times before. But this time, something was different. As she turned to face him, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity he couldn't quite place. And when she spoke, it wasn't with fear, but with the kind of calm confidence that sent a chill through Rick's spine. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice steady, "but I think you've made a mistake." Rick barely had time to process her words before her hands reached into her blazer, pulling out a leather wallet. She opened it slowly, revealing a gleaming FBI badge. Rick froze, his entire world tilted on its axis. The woman wasn't just a random target. She was an undercover FBI agent. Everything he had just done, every lie he had just told, crashed down on him in that moment. He had framed a federal agent, and now his life, his entire world, was about to unravel. This is the beginning of Rick Daniels' downfall, the moment he betrayed the system, and the moment his world started to shatter. But as the FBI agent, Tasha Owens, stared at him with unblinking eyes, Rick had no idea how far this betrayal would take him, how deep the corruption went, and how, in the end, he would have to make an impossible choice, a path of no return. Rick Daniels couldn't breathe. His hands felt cold, and for a moment, the noise in the cafe, the murmuring voices, the clinking of cups, the soft hum of the espresso machine, faded into a dull ringing in his ears. Everything felt too sharp, too sudden. The badge, the cold, metallic glint of the FBI credentials that had been slid across the table to him. He looked at the woman, the agent, standing before him, handcuffs still dangling from her wrists, her eyes fixed on his, studying him like a puzzle that she had already solved. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice calm, controlled, but there was something deeper in her eyes, a quiet understanding, like she knew exactly what he had done. "Well, what the hell is this?" Rick stammered, his thoughts racing. He had planted evidence on her. He had framed her, an FBI agent. He felt the ground beneath him shift. In that moment, everything he knew about himself, about his job, about what he thought was right and wrong, felt like a lie. "You know exactly what this is," she said softly. "But I'm sure you have questions. I'll answer them. But first, I need you to listen." Rick's stomach churned. He had been in this situation before, but never like this. Never with someone who had the power to ruin everything in his life. He had never been this far gone, this entangled in the web of corruption. But here he was, standing across from a federal agent who had just revealed his crime. "You're FBI." Rick's voice was barely a whisper, as if he were trying to convince himself that this wasn't happening, that somehow this wasn't real. But the badge, the calm confidence in her voice, it was too real. The weight of his guilt bore down on him harder than the hangover that still lingered in his head. "Yes," Tasha Owens answered simply. "I've been undercover for months, investigating a network of corruption within this precinct. And you're a part of that system, Officer Daniels, whether you like it or not." The words hit Rick like a physical blow. He had heard the rumors, the whispers about corruption in the department. He had even seen the signs himself, the questionable arrests, the shady deals made in the dark corners of the precinct. But he had always told himself it wasn't his problem. It was just doing his job. But now, standing here, facing this woman, this federal agent, it was clear that it had always been his problem. Rick opened his mouth, trying to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had betrayed someone he didn't even know. Worse, he had framed someone who had the power to bring down the very system he had spent years working for. His life, his career, everything he had built, was now hanging by a thread. Tasha's eyes softened, just a little. "I'm not here to take you down, Rick. But I need you to understand something. What you did today, planting that evidence on me, trying to frame me for a crime I didn't commit, wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a much bigger, much darker machine. And it's only going to get worse for you the longer you stay in it." Rick stood there, silent. His fingers twitched toward his belt, toward his service weapon, but he knew it was too late. The damage had already been done. There was no turning back. Not now. Not after what he had done. Tasha's expression hardened. "You're not the first cop Monroe has turned into his puppet, but you might be the last if you choose to do the right thing." Rick swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. He could feel his pulse thudding in his neck, the adrenaline that had been coursing through him earlier now replaced by a deep sense of dread. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything, of how he had ended up here. It had started so simple. He was just following orders, just doing his job. But now he was a part of something far bigger, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. "Why me?" Rick managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Why me? Out of all the people." Tasha looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're the one who planted the evidence. You're the one who made the arrest. You're the one who put this whole thing in motion." She paused, and for the first time, a flicker of something, sympathy, maybe, crossed her face. "But I get it. The system has a way of grinding people down, of making them feel like they don't have a choice. I've seen it before. Cops who start out with good intentions, and then, over time, they get lost in the system. They become part of the problem." Rick's breath caught in his throat. The words hit too close to home. He had started out like that, believing in justice, in doing the right thing. But somewhere along the way, he had become numb. He had lost sight of what mattered. And now, here he was, stuck in a game he had no idea how to win. Tasha's eyes softened again. "You can't undo what you've done. But you can make it right. You can help me take down Monroe and everyone else involved in this mess. You can make it stop." Rick looked at her, her gaze unwavering. He wanted to say no, wanted to walk away, pretend this wasn't his problem. But the truth was, it was his problem. It had always been his problem. And the longer he ignored it, the worse it would get. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tasha leaned in, her voice low, but filled with urgency. "I need to expose everything. All the dirty deals, the fake arrests, the corruption. But I can't do it alone. You have to help me get the evidence. You have to be the one to bring it all down." Rick felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy cloak. He was being asked to destroy everything he had ever known, his career, his life, the lies he had built his identity on. But in that moment, as he looked into Tasha's steady, determined eyes, he knew that there was no other choice. He couldn't keep living this lie. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when he knew, deep down, that it wasn't. "All right," Rick said, his voice steady now, as if he had made his peace with the choice. "I'll help you. But I need a plan. I need to know how we're going to do this." Tasha nodded. "First, we need to get out of here. Monroe won't stop until I'm dead. And you?" She gave him a hard look. "You're not safe either. They'll come for you. They'll come for both of us." Rick's mind raced. He knew that Tasha was right. The moment he helped her, the moment he sided with her, there would be no going back. His career was over. His life as he knew it was finished. But he couldn't turn away now. Not when he had seen the truth. "Where do we go from here?" Rick asked, ready to make the first move. Tasha stood up, her posture straight, composed. "We take everything Monroe has worked so hard to hide. We take down the entire network. But first, we need to get to the files, the evidence. We need to expose them all before they get to us." Rick followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. They weren't just running from the system anymore. They were about to tear it down, together. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They weren't going to stop until they brought Monroe and everyone like him to their knees. The game had changed, and Rick Daniels was no longer playing by the rules. The escape. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting harsh shadows on the walls of the dimly lit alley behind the police precinct. Rick Daniels' heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline from his conversation with Tasha still coursing through his veins. His hand shook as he gripped the steering wheel of the stolen car, eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. The chase had begun. He had crossed the line in ways he never thought possible. The moment he decided to help Tasha Owens, an FBI agent framed by his own hands, everything changed. His career, his future, his entire life was now in jeopardy. Tasha sat beside him, her eyes scanning the empty street ahead. Her composure hadn't faltered for a second. Her face was a mask of determination, her focus unwavering. Despite the chaos surrounding them, she exuded an aura of calm control. She knew the danger they were in. She knew what was at stake. "Keep your head straight, Rick," Tasha said quietly, her voice steady but carrying an underlying edge of urgency. "Don't look back. Don't give them any reason to suspect anything." Rick swallowed hard and nodded. He hadn't stopped thinking about Monroe. The captain's cold, calculating face was burned into his memory. Monroe had created this system of corruption, this network of lies, and now, for the first time in his life, Rick had to face the truth. The truth about what he had been complicit in, about how deep the corruption went. And now he had nowhere to hide. Every cop in the city would be looking for him. Monroe would stop at nothing to cover his tracks, to keep his empire intact. Rick's fingers clenched tighter around the wheel, his mind whirling. His thoughts turned to the files Tasha had uncovered. The evidence was real. It wasn't just rumors anymore. It wasn't just hearsay or speculation. Monroe had been selling arrests for cash, framing people for crimes they didn't commit, all to protect his own corrupt interests. And Rick had been part of it. He had played his role in a system that was rotten to the core, and now he had to make things right. "We have to hit Monroe where it hurts," Tasha continued, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at Rick. "We need to get those files, the ones that tie him to the illegal payments. We have to expose the entire operation before it's too late." Rick nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. He couldn't run anymore. Not from the truth. Not from the consequences of his actions. And definitely not from the system he had been part of for far too long. It was time to fight back. "Where do we go now?" Rick asked, his voice strained with the weight of what he was about to do. We can't just waltz into Monroe's office and take the files. They'll have every cop in the city looking for us by now." Tasha's lips curled into a tight, determined smile. "We're not going to Monroe's office. Not yet, at least. First, we need to go to the one place he hasn't accounted for, the DA's office. We need to get their files. The ones they've been keeping on the precinct. They're the key to bringing him down." Rick's eyes flicked toward Tasha. He hadn't expected her to be so confident. But then again, he didn't know what he'd expected. She had already proven that she was a force to be reckoned with. She had a plan, and he wasn't going to question it. They drove in silence for a few moments, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The city was waking up, the early morning lights spilling over the skyline as they sped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic. Rick's nerves were on edge. He could feel the eyes of the city on them. Every patrol car that passed seemed to carry with it the weight of the hunt. They were fugitives now, on the run, racing against time. As they neared the outskirts of town, Rick's mind went over the plan again. The DA's office was their only shot at getting the kind of evidence they needed to take down Monroe. They couldn't afford to mess this up. If they got caught now, it would all be over. They had to be smart. They had to move fast. Tasha glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "This isn't going to be easy. The DA's office is locked down tight. But we'll get in. We'll get the files, and then we can move forward." Rick shot her a look. "How can you be so sure?" "I've been in tougher situations," she replied. "I've faced worse than this, and I've always come out on top." Her confidence, despite everything they were facing, was like a lifeline. Rick knew they didn't have much time. The further they got from the precinct, the less likely it was they could turn back. The risks were piling up. Every moment they spent on the road made it more likely someone would catch on to them. They parked a few blocks away from the DA's office, in a dark alley behind an old warehouse. Rick took a deep breath as they stepped out of the car, the weight of their situation sinking in once again. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking down a corrupt system that had been festering for years. It was about redemption, if such a thing existed for someone like him. Rick followed Tasha as she led the way down the narrow street, her movements purposeful, her eyes scanning every corner. She wasn't taking any chances. They had to get in and out without being noticed. "This way," Tasha whispered, pulling him toward a hidden entrance at the back of the building. The door was marked with a faded sign indicating it was a service entrance. Rick's breath quickened. They had to move quickly, but quietly. Tasha swiped a keycard she'd swiped from a former contact, and the door clicked open. Rick could hear the faint hum of machinery on the other side, the sound of the building's security systems. He felt his heartbeat speed up. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit, with flickering emergency lights casting long shadows along the walls. Rick felt his nerves jump at every creak of the floorboards beneath his boots, but Tasha moved like a shadow, gliding through the corridor with ease. They'd reached the records room without incident, and Tasha quickly went to work, pulling out a laptop and connecting it to the terminal on the desk. The room smelled of old paper and dust, the faint scent of age lingering in the air. Rick kept watch, standing by the door, his eyes scanning the hallway outside. 5 minutes, Tasha muttered as she typed furiously. "Just 5 minutes, and we'll have everything we need." Rick nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Every creak, every distant footstep made his skin crawl. The door creaked behind him, and Rick's hand instinctively went to his holstered weapon. He froze, eyes darting to Tasha. She was still focused on the screen, her fingers moving with calculated precision. He had to be patient. He had to trust her. Then, a faint sound, like the scraping of shoes on concrete, reached his ears. Rick tensed, his body coiling like a spring. He moved to the door, peering around the corner, but there was nothing. Just shadows and empty halls. Tasha's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're in." The files are downloading now. We're good to go. Rick felt a weight lift off his chest. They had the evidence. The truth was about to come out. But just as Tasha finished up, Rick's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, heart sinking when he saw the name on the screen. Monroe. The captain's words were clear, even over the crackling phone line. I know what you've done, Daniels. You can run, but you can't hide. You've made a terrible mistake. And now, you'll pay for it. Rick's blood ran cold. Monroe knew. Monroe was coming for them. We need to move, now, Rick said, his voice hoarse. Tasha didn't hesitate. She grabbed the flash drive with the evidence, and together, they sprinted out of the building, through the alley and into the darkness. The city, once a place where they had walked without fear, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. Every turn, every street corner, could be hiding Monroe's men, waiting to strike. The sirens were already beginning to wail in the distance, the sound growing louder with each passing second. Their window of escape was closing. We don't have much time, Rick said, his voice urgent. Monroe's coming for us. We have to go now. Tasha glanced at him, her face set with grim determination. We don't just run anymore. We fight back. And we're going to make sure Monroe pays for what he's done. They didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. The chase had begun in earnest, and they would stop at nothing to bring the corrupt system down. The web tightens. The streets of the city stretched out before Rick Daniels like a maze, each turn and shadow hiding something far darker than he had ever imagined. The stolen car's tires hummed against the pavement as Tasha Owens sat beside him, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror, constantly checking for signs of pursuit. Rick could feel his chest tighten with every mile they put between themselves and the DA's office. They had the evidence now. The files that could bring Captain Monroe down. The files that could expose a network of corruption that had been thriving under the city's very nose. But the weight of it all was almost unbearable. Every passing car, every patrol unit that rumbled past, felt like an omen. They were being hunted. And Rick knew that Monroe wasn't the kind of man to let a betrayal slide. The system they had lived within, one that had kept them both in line for so long, was now their enemy. Rick gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had known corruption existed. He had seen the signs, ignored the whispers in the halls. But it wasn't until he was staring down the barrel of his own guilt, standing side by side with Tasha, that he realized the depths of it. Monroe hadn't just been selling arrests for cash. He had been orchestrating a system that fed on the broken and the helpless, creating a web of lies that entangled everyone in its path. What now? Rick asked, his voice low, trying to keep the panic from creeping in. We've got the files. We've got what we came for. But we're not safe yet. We're not even close. Tasha turned to him, her face set in grim determination. We're not running forever, Rick. We're going to take Monroe down. We've got enough to expose him, but we need more. We need proof of his connections, his ties to the crime syndicates, the money laundering, the blackmail, everything. Rick nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. He had seen what Monroe was capable of, what the system could do when it was pushed to its limits. This wasn't going to be easy. Every second they spent in the open was a risk. But the longer they waited, the more time Monroe had to cover his tracks. They pulled into a small, inconspicuous motel on the edge of town, away from the prying eyes of the city. The place was old, the kind of spot where people passed through without being noticed, which was exactly what they needed. Rick parked the car under the dim streetlight and killed the engine. The sound of the tires crunching on the gravel echoed through the quiet night. Tasha was the first to step out of the car, her movements smooth, purposeful. Rick followed her, his eyes scanning the area. The motel seemed abandoned, with only a few cars scattered in the parking lot. No one would notice them here. They made their way inside, the stale air of the motel lobby greeting them with a musty smell. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as they passed, too tired to care about anything going on in his small world. Rick could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Every second was a countdown. Monroe wouldn't waste any time. The man had already shown that he was willing to go to any lengths to keep his empire intact. Tasha led them down a narrow hallway, and they entered a room at the far end. It was small, the furniture old and worn, but it would do. Rick collapsed into a chair, his body aching from the tension that had been building for days. His eyes drifted to Tasha, who was already setting up her laptop, preparing to dig through the files they had retrieved. "How long do we have?" Rick asked, his voice hoarse. Tasha didn't look up from her work, but her answer was firm. "We don't have long. Monroe will already be working on damage control. We need to get this data to the right people before he can cover his tracks." Rick ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. "And what do we do if they catch us before then?" "We make sure they don't," Tasha said, her eyes hardening. "We've already taken one step too far to turn back. Now we have to finish what we started. We expose him. We expose the system that's been controlling this city for years." Rick let out a long, shaky breath. The thought of taking down Monroe, of tearing apart the system that had shaped his life, felt surreal. How had he allowed himself to get this deep? How had he ignored the signs for so long? Tasha finished plugging in the flash drive and turned to face him. "This isn't just about Monroe anymore. It's about the entire department, Rick. It's about the way this system manipulates everyone. The people who have been hurt, the lives ruined, the families torn apart. All of it has to come to light. We can't just take down Monroe. We have to dismantle the entire operation." Rick's stomach churned as he thought of all the faces, the innocent people who had paid the price for his complicity. He had been part of this machine. He had helped to ruin lives for quotas and political pressure. He was just as guilty as Monroe. He looked at Tasha, who was busy sorting through the documents on the screen, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She had been working undercover for months, gathering intel, building a case that could bring everything crashing down. But it wasn't just about Monroe anymore. It was about everyone who had been dragged into this web, everyone who had been crushed under the weight of a corrupt system. "How do we get the rest of it?" Rick asked, breaking the silence. Tasha glanced up from the screen, her expression hard. "We go after the money. We get into Monroe's accounts, his connections with the crime syndicates, the shell companies he's been funneling money through, the police department's dirty deals. We need it all." Rick nodded slowly, the weight of the task before them sinking in. They weren't just fighting Monroe anymore. They were fighting an entire system that had been rotting from the inside for years. As Tasha continued to work, Rick stood up and paced the room. His mind was racing, trying to plan their next steps. He knew that time was running out. Monroe's people were already closing in on them, and every move they made would bring them closer to danger. Just as he was about to speak, Tasha's voice cut through the tension. "We need a safe house, somewhere we can lay low while we prepare to move forward with the investigation, somewhere we won't be found." Rick stopped pacing and looked at her. "You know a place." Tasha's eyes narrowed. "I know a guy who can help us. He's been monitoring Monroe's operation from the outside. He's got access to information we don't, but he'll only work with us if we can get him something big, something undeniable." Rick's heart began to race again. Every time he thought they were one step ahead, the game shifted. "So we trade the evidence for help." Tasha gave him a pointed look. "It's not a trade, Rick. It's the only way we move forward. We need to leverage what we have, or Monroe's people will take us down before we even get a chance to expose him. We make this count." Rick's jaw clenched as he nodded. He understood. They didn't have the luxury of time. Every moment they wasted was another opportunity for Monroe to bury the truth, for his empire of corruption to stay intact. They were in too deep now. There was no turning back. The night dragged on, and Tasha worked tirelessly, sifting through the files, piecing together the damning evidence they would need. Rick kept watch, his mind still reeling from the enormity of their situation. But in the midst of the chaos, a single thought kept circling his mind. They had to survive this. They had to tear down the system before it consumed them both. As the clock ticked past midnight, Rick's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, his fingers trembling. The message was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything they had risked. I know who you are. The walls are closing in. We move tomorrow night. Be ready. Rick's eyes locked with Tasha's as the reality of their situation hit him like a freight train. The game had changed. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for the truth. And everything was on the line. Tomorrow night, they would make their move, and there would be no turning back. Racing the clock. The pale light of dawn crept through the grimy curtains, casting long, jagged shadows across the motel room. Rick Daniels sat on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress as his mind raced. Every second felt like an eternity. They were getting closer to exposing Monroe, closer to unraveling the corruption that had poisoned the police department. But with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. The web they were entangled in was far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Tasha Owens sat at the small desk, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard, piecing together the files they had gathered. Her face was tense, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sifted through evidence that could potentially take down an entire network of dirty cops, crime syndicates, and corrupt officials. She was a professional, but even Rick could see the toll this was taking on her. Every click of the mouse, every document she opened, seemed to weigh heavier than the last. Rick stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to see the street outside. The street was quiet, but Rick knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Monroe's men were closing in on them. They had already eliminated the safe house he had known about. His own former colleagues had started making moves to track them down, and the clock was ticking. Every minute they wasted was another opportunity for Monroe's team to clean up the mess they had made, to bury the evidence and ensure that the system remained intact. Tasha paused for a moment and looked up at him, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "Rick, we don't have much time. If we wait any longer, Monroe will bury the truth. We need to act now." Rick turned to face her, meeting her gaze. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no second guessing. She was determined, but the lines of exhaustion were evident on her face. He could see the same weight on her shoulders that he felt in his gut, the weight of everything they had to lose. "I know," Rick said, his voice low. "I just keep thinking, what if we don't make it? What if this isn't enough? Monroe has too many resources, too many connections. He'll make sure everything disappears." Tasha stood up and walked toward him, her eyes sharp as they locked onto his. "We don't get to think about that, Rick. We're already past the point of no return. The moment you decided to help me, we made a choice, and we're not turning back now." Her words hit harder than expected, reminding him of the gravity of their situation. He had been drowning in doubt for days, questioning everything he had ever known about justice and the system he had been part of. But in this moment, standing alongside Tasha, there was only one thing that mattered: the truth. They had the files. They had the evidence to expose Monroe for who he really was, and they had to make sure that nothing stood in their way. Rick's phone buzzed in his pocket, the familiar jolt of fear shooting through him. He pulled it out and saw the message. It was from their contact, the person who had been monitoring Monroe's operation from the outside. "I've got the location. It's now or never. Make sure you're ready." Rick's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The final move. The location. The last piece of the puzzle. But something didn't feel right. He had no idea if they would make it out alive after tonight. They had already made too many enemies. Too many people who would stop at nothing to see them fail. "We've got the location," Rick said, looking at Tasha. "It's time." Tasha nodded, her face unreadable. "Let's go." They left the motel without looking back, moving quickly through the quiet streets as the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting a golden hue over the city. The weight of the day hung heavy in the air, but neither of them said a word as they made their way to the car. There was no need for small talk. The gravity of their mission was enough to keep them focused. As they drove through the city, Rick couldn't help but feel like they were walking a fine line. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything they had worked for would be lost. Monroe was dangerous, but what was even more dangerous was the power of the system they were trying to destroy. The streets blurred as they passed, each turn bringing them closer to their destination. Rick could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to come. They pulled up to a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It was an old industrial warehouse, the kind that looked abandoned but was anything but. Tasha glanced at Rick, her eyes narrowing. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "Stay close. We can't afford to be seen." They both exited the car, moving quickly and quietly toward the entrance. Rick's hand hovered near his holster as they approached the building. He knew they were walking into the lion's den. Every shadow could be a threat. Every corner could hide an enemy. Tasha led the way, her movements sharp and efficient. She knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they needed to do. Rick was grateful for her calm demeanor, but the closer they got to the door, the more anxious he became. It was too quiet. It was too still. Something didn't feel right. When they reached the entrance, Tasha held up her hand, signaling for Rick to stop. She carefully checked the door, testing the handle. It was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, peering inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with the smell of dust and oil. Rick's eyes scanned the space, looking for any signs of movement. The building appeared empty. But Rick wasn't fooled. He knew Monroe's people would be watching, waiting for them to make their move. "We've got to move fast," Tasha whispered. "Get to the back room. We need to secure the files and get out before they can track us." They moved through the warehouse, their footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. The silence was deafening, but it was also a cover. Every step brought them closer to their goal, and Rick could feel the tension building in his chest. They were so close. Just a few more minutes, and they would have the evidence they needed to bring Monroe down. But as they rounded a corner, Rick froze. A shadow moved in the distance. He held his breath, motioning for Tasha to stop. They stood still for a moment, listening. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, growing louder with each passing second. Monroe's men were close. They had been tracked. Rick's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Tasha, his eyes wide with realization. "Move," he hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a nearby door. They burst into a small room at the back of the warehouse, the door slamming shut behind them. Rick's breath was ragged as he looked around, searching for an escape. The room was full of filing cabinets and boxes, the perfect place to hide the evidence they had worked so hard to uncover. Tasha quickly started rifling through the cabinets, her hands moving with practiced speed. Rick kept watch, his senses on high alert. The footsteps outside were getting closer, and he knew that they didn't have much time. Finally, Tasha pulled out a thick folder from one of the cabinets. She held it up, her face grim. "This is it. This is everything we need." Rick's pulse quickened. "We have to get out of here. Now." Tasha nodded, tucking the folder under her arm. They had what they came for. But getting out of the building alive would be the hard part. Monroe's men were closing in on them. The storm was about to break, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. The door to the back room burst open, and Rick's hand shot to his gun. Monroe's men were here. The game had changed. This wasn't just about the files anymore. It was about survival. Tasha grabbed Rick's arm, pulling him toward the window. "We have one shot at this. No going back." Rick didn't hesitate. They climbed through the window and dropped into the alley below, their hearts pounding in their chests as they sprinted into the night, the weight of the evidence, and the danger heavy on their shoulders. The chase was on, and this time, they weren't running from the truth. They were running with it. The final hour. The narrow alley behind the warehouse swallowed Rick Daniels and Tasha Owens whole, the thick shadows of the night masking their every move. The sounds of their footsteps were muffled by the grimy, wet pavement as they sprinted into the heart of the industrial district, the weight of the evidence clutched tightly in Tasha's hands. The folder that could take down Captain Monroe, the folder that contained everything. All the financial records, all the bribes, all the lies, was now their only bargaining chip, and they had no choice but to move fast. Rick's breath came in heavy gasps, his lungs burning from the sprint, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that weighed him down. It was the gnawing fear in his gut. Monroe knew. He had known all along. The system had eyes everywhere, ears in every corner, and Rick was starting to realize just how much of the department was complicit in the web of lies they had been living in. "We have to get out of here," Tasha hissed, her voice urgent, yet controlled. She was always in control, always calculating. But Rick could see the strain in her eyes. They were both running on adrenaline now, and it wouldn't last long. He glanced over his shoulder, his mind racing. He knew it was only a matter of time before Monroe's men found them. The warehouse had been a trap, a rat's maze designed to corner them. But they had fought back, gotten what they needed. Now, they were on borrowed time. "We need to reach the extraction point," Tasha continued, pushing him forward. "We can't go back to the city. Too many eyes. There's a safe house outside of town. We'll regroup there, but we need a clean getaway. Do you know the back streets?" Rick nodded. His mind snapped into focus. He had spent years on these streets. He knew the twists and turns like the back of his hand. He knew where the surveillance cameras were down, where the shadows were thick enough to hide in. They just had to get through the next few miles without drawing attention. They turned a corner, the dim light of a street lamp casting an eerie glow on the pavement. Rick felt the weight of the world pressing in on him, but there was no time for hesitation, no time for regret. "I'll lead the way," Rick said, his voice steady. Even though his pulse was thrumming with fear, he could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer with each passing second. Monroe's people would be looking for them by now, searching every alley, every side street, hunting them down like prey. They moved quickly, ducking into the shadows, blending into the night as much as they could. But there was nowhere to hide forever. Monroe's operation was too vast. The resources at his disposal were endless. And now, Rick and Tasha were fugitives, marked by everyone who had ever worn the badge. "We're almost there," Rick whispered, glancing back to make sure no one had followed them. The street ahead was empty, the only sound the distant hum of city traffic and the beat of their footsteps. Tasha didn't respond. She was focused, eyes sharp, scanning the surroundings as if she could sense danger in the air before it even arrived. She had seen too much to be caught off guard now. They rounded another corner, and Rick's heart skipped a beat. There, parked on the side of the road, was a black SUV, an unmarked police vehicle. The door was open, and inside, sitting behind the wheel, was a familiar face. "Paul," Rick muttered under his breath. His heart sank as the realization hit him. Paul Grayson, his old partner, now one of Monroe's enforcers, had sold them out. Tasha's eyes narrowed as she looked at Rick, reading the change in his expression. "What's wrong?" Rick clenched his jaw. "He's one of them. He's with Monroe now. We can't trust him." Before Tasha could respond, the sound of a car engine revved from behind them. Rick turned sharply, his stomach dropping as a patrol car came into view, its headlights cutting through the night. It was coming straight toward them. "Go," Rick shouted, grabbing Tasha's arm and pulling her into a narrow alley. They sprinted, the sound of their footsteps drowned by the roar of the engine. Rick's mind raced. They had to get ahead of the car. They had to lose them before it was too late. Tasha's breath was ragged beside him, but she didn't slow down. She didn't flinch. She was right there with him, moving with the same sense of urgency. They had no choice now. No room for hesitation. They couldn't stop. Not when they were so close. The alley curved, leading them through a maze of abandoned warehouses and old industrial sites. The smell of diesel fuel and rusted metal filled the air, and the sound of the approaching patrol car was like a ticking clock, marking every precious second. Rick glanced over his shoulder. The patrol car was still gaining on them. They were getting too close. Up ahead, Rick shouted, pointing to a fire escape ladder that led to the roof of a nearby building. It was their only chance. If they could get on the roof, they could lose the car and regroup. Tasha nodded, understanding the plan immediately. Without a word, they broke into a sprint, their legs burning, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they reached the base of the fire escape. Rick grabbed the bottom rung and hoisted himself up, Tasha following right behind. But just as they reached the second floor, Rick heard it. The sound of boots on the pavement. Monroe's men were closing in. They were running out of time. "Go, go!" Rick shouted, pulling Tasha up onto the roof. They scrambled onto the flat surface, but as Rick turned to look back at the fire escape, he saw them. 3 figures, armed and ready, climbing up behind them. "No way out," Tasha said under her breath, her eyes scanning the roof for an escape route. But Rick knew they were cornered. There was nowhere to run. The only option left was to fight. Rick pulled out his gun, checking the ammo. It wasn't much. Just a few rounds left. But it would have to be enough. Tasha took position beside him, her own weapon raised, her eyes sharp. They could hear the sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to the roof. The men were getting closer. Tasha's voice was calm, even in the face of danger. "We take them out quickly. We move once they're down." Rick nodded. "On my mark." They didn't have much time. The figures emerged from the rooftop door, their silhouettes outlined by the dim light. Rick's finger tightened on the trigger. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't flinch. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "Now," Rick shouted. The first shot rang out, echoing through the empty streets below. The man in the front dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the ground. But the others were quick, ducking for cover behind the vents and air conditioning units that dotted the roof. Rick moved forward, Tasha by his side. They fired in quick succession, taking down one more. But the third man was smart. He crouched low, moving behind the stack of crates at the far end of the roof. "Keep your head down," Rick yelled, watching as the last of Monroe's men began to move. The gunfire was loud, but the only thing Rick could focus on was survival. If they didn't take out the last man, they'd be finished. Tasha fired first, her shot grazing the man's shoulder, forcing him to stagger back. That was all the opening Rick needed. He stepped into the line of fire and aimed carefully. One shot. One chance. The bullet struck true, and the man collapsed, his weapon clattering to the rooftop. Rick exhaled sharply, his heart still hammering in his chest. But they weren't out of danger yet. More would be coming. Monroe wouldn't let them get away this easily. Tasha grabbed Rick's arm and pulled him toward the edge of the roof. "We need to move. Now." They didn't hesitate. They couldn't afford to. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, and Rick knew their time was running out. Monroe's empire was crumbling, but if they didn't get the files to the right people, and fast, they would be lost in the chaos. Rick and Tasha ran toward the fire escape at the far end of the building, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They had one shot left, one chance to bring everything down. And they weren't going to stop until they did.